Don't look at me! God!
Radio Free Intimate episode 315. Got some more death metal stuff going on this week. 3 brutal death metal bands from around the world who are putting out stuff during my favorite era of brutal death metal, that being the 90s and early 2000s. Because I'll get down to all day, every day, twice a day on Sundays. Don't get me wrong, but I prefer stuff from when the genre wasn't as codified and bands were a little bit more unique sounding. First band up is a band I heard about on YouTube from our boy Jimmy.
Yo, my left nut is twisted.
Though I'm pretty sure I've also seen the dog wearing their shirts before. Rotting from Canada.
Hey, Buzz, man, are you watching this documentary Saskatchewan?
You know, when I say early brutal death metal from Canada, you're probably thinking this is going to sound a certain kind of way. You know, maybe a little cryptopsy, maybe a little cataclysm. Wrong! This came out on Guttural Records in the late 90s, and it's got one of those real-life gore covers, actually resembling a reenactment of the cover of the first Obituary album, at least to my eyes. And whilst the music is unmistakably brutal death metal, it actually has more in common aesthetically with a lot of the old-school European death metal than it does with Deeds of Flesh or Disgorge. For instance, the way the album starts out is very similar to how Seance's Salt Rubbed Eyes starts out, with all the instrumentals and vocals and everything going all at once. Speaking of which, the vocals are a little bit less Frank Mullen and a little bit more Jorgen Sandstrom from Grave, which is pretty unique. Guitars are also total Swedish Chainsaw, but where it really separates itself from regular brutal death metal is in the lead guitar department, which honestly sounds a whole lot like something you'd hear on one of the more ethereal early Finnish bands, like Early Sentenced or Amorphous. That was what immediately caught my ear when I put this album on for the first time. That and just the really heavy emphasis on these absolutely brutal grinding grooves. This is definitely a band with a heavy focus on rhythmic intensity. Like, check out this variation. Reminds me a whole lot of the kind of stuff you'd hear from Gutted and Baphomet, those bands I covered way back on episode 219, which is always good because especially as I've gotten older, that Gutted album, Bleed For Us To Live, has really rocketed up into my death metal top 10. And it's interesting to hear somebody tackle that sound with a very different aesthetic, that being the very obvious Swedish chainsaw guitar and these Finnish death metal style guitar leads. Two things that you wouldn't think would work in a brutal death metal context, especially that buzzy guitar sound, but something about the way it combines with that really loud snare and the fact that it is slightly tighter and sharper than your standard Swedish chainsaw means that not only does it end up working out, not only are these guys an amazing brutal death metal band, but honestly they're also doing a better job of accidentally playing Swedish style death metal than most of the retro death bands running around nowadays. A lot of times when people are talking about particularly groovy variants of brutal death metal, and even more specifically a lot of the slam death bands, they'll go like, man, this stuff is great, it's so dumb. You know, it's caveman metal.
As I said during the campaign, I'm just a caveman. I fell in some ice and later got thawed out by scientists. But there is one thing I do know.
Such a label could certainly be applied to Rotting, but I believe that does them a disservice because on the surface, yeah, it does seem like they got some pretty simple, groovy kind of death metal, but the way they actually construct those grooves is rather subtle and clever. A lot of this has to do with how complicated the drumming gets. It's way more heavy on fills than you might expect for such groove-oriented death metal. Guys doing all sorts of weird mastodon rolls all over the place without sounding too wanky, but there's also a heavy emphasis on deconstruction and reconstruction. For instance, this little 2-note chug bit here is actually a fragment of the riff that opened up the song. Later on in the song, they bring back the rest of that riff, but in a new rhythmic context. Right here, but they've also moved it up the guitar neck a little bit. That's what I mean by it's subtle, but there is cleverness there. Cavemen can be smart too.
Me Grimlock, no bozo, me king!
When they speed up a bit, you can really hear how they are kind of using that Swedish chainsaw. And it sounds heavy as shit, especially when they drop it back into a more groove-oriented context. Overall, Rotting's sole full-length album, Crushed, is about as close to a perfect death metal album as you can get. The only thing wrong with it is it's super duper out of print. Nobody's repressing it, so if you want to buy a physical copy of this, hope you got $108 for some scalper and Discogs. Otherwise, you're just going to have to make do with MP3s.
God!
Up next, we got what is unequivocally a J-Dog band.
Fucking busy ass wife. Don't ever call this goddamn number. I'm in the middle of fucking goddamn it. He hung up. Good.
That being Desecration from Wales?
Just up the road from Llanfair Pwllgwyngyll, go get a Quindrobos, Llantysilio, go, go, go.
Didn't expect to end up covering a Welsh band on Radio Free Innsmouth. Not sure how many more of these are in the can, but we got one. They're also notable for being probably the only death metal band that's helmed by an actual licensed and practicing mortician.
The funeral is about to begin, sir.
Which is brutal as fuck, and probably how main man Ollie Jones got away with being a short-haired death metal dude in the 90s. Hard to get more death metal clout than just actually being a mortician. Not that clout helped them out too much, because these guys had some serious censorship troubles in their early years. Everybody knows the United Kingdom is pretty ish when it comes to matters of gore, witness the video nasties and all that debacle. And that resulted in their first album, Gore and Perversion, being banned in its original Arctic Serenades issue, and all of its master tapes being destroyed. A few CDs did manage to squeak out with the cover being censored. If you're curious, the original album cover featured a rather Mark Riddick-esque drawing of a naked guy doing some rather silly things with his wiener.
Being silly ass, like a big ass, or yeah, dick peck or whatever. So
and because of that, not too many people have heard the original version of their first album, and it's become something of a death metal legend, an unholy grail of sorts. It actually did end up getting reissued relatively recently. I'm guessing they sourced the sound from one of the few CDs that managed to squeak out, given that the master tapes were destroyed. And I'm glad it's out there now, because honestly, this album does kind of live up to its legend. It's really nasty stuff, and it employs a lot of the same subtle rhythmic variant tricks that Rotting did a few years later. For instance, you'll get a song that starts out with a pretty simple sounding riff like this one right here. Got a whole lot of groove to it, quite catchy. But as the riff repeats recursively, they start to introduce subtle little variations into it, like this bit right here. Just change a couple of notes at the end, it becomes an entirely new riff, allowing them to transition into a much more grindcore sounding section. Maybe it's just because their neighbors on the island are bands like Napalm Death and Malediction, but there's a whole lot of grindcore to this music, to the point where the modern day version of Extreme Noise Terror you can see playing live nowadays is basically just the original vocalist from the 80s with everybody from Desecration backing him up. Kind of like that one Possessed reunion where the entire backing band was just the guys from Sadistic Intent. Anyways, this is brutal death metal, so there's gonna be some nasty fucking breakdowns. Made all the nastier by the fact that these guys have a very potent hardcore influence. Like I said, they're the backing band for Extreme Noise Terror nowadays. The overall filthiness of the guitar sound on this first album definitely hits hardest during these breakdown sections. And if you want to hear a really filthy early take on the brutal death metal sound, you're not going to get much nastier than Desecration's Gore and Perversion. Like I said, the album was banned by a major world government, all right? That's how intense this is. But their most famous album, probably, the one that gets talked about the most, is their second album, 1998's Murder in Mind.
Believe me, if I started murdering people, there'd be none of you left.
To my ears, this one leans even harder into that early earache grindcore sound Gone brutal death metal, and even their first album did. Also, vocalist Ollie. This time around, he's also playing drums. He's got a pretty unique style, not really the standard sort of death metal drumming that a lot of people are used to at all, and it gives this album a really weird off-kilter flavor. It's a lot more barbaric and slapped together sounding than brutal death metal usually is, but in a good way. And it definitely kind of brings everything closer to its grindcore roots. It also results in groove parts that almost sound like they're falling apart. Just this nasty, shambling corpse of a death metal band. And it gets even sicker when they slow it down.
Yeah, boy.
I mean, that's just oozing all kinds of nasty juices. And then we jump right back into some more death grindy sounding stuff. Gonna have those real 80s style sloppy blast beats. And then it transitions into some more twisted sounding pure death metal material. This whole album is just this mix of grindcore, death metal, a little bit of hardcore, and whatever the fuck kind of weird Welsh swamp water they were drinking. And it is fantastic. The third and final band for today isn't a Jimmy band or a J-Dog band. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and say this is a Jub band because I am the only person I've ever even heard mention these fellas. Polluted Inheritance from the Netherlands, who are probably the most notable case of
"You're not supposed to be here"
in death metal history, because these guys put out an album that sounds quite a bit like modern technical brutal death metal way back in 1992.
Holy smokers.
I'm having a hard time thinking of anything else from the year 1992 that was this spazzy while still maintaining this level of precision in the death metal field. It's got an almost Suffocation-esque groove to it, but the speed of the riffs honestly brings to mind tech thrash more than anything else. And you couple that with the super clinical production, especially for 1992, where you can hear everything going on, it shows off how insane this music really is. They also utilize a lot of cool riff variants. Like right here, this is that same riff from earlier. Now it's been given a much more groove-oriented cast, underscored by this awesome bass part right here. And I really am surprised that this album in particular isn't more well-known. Maybe it's the band name, the lyrical content, and the album cover giving off more of a life metal vibe, not really showing off how intense the music actually is. Maybe it's just because it was on the tiny label Morbid Music and not distributed that well. But, this stuff is from 1992, it's super technical, and it has fucking slams. Like, this stuff is crazy ahead of its time. I'd say a decent chunk of the surprising brutality of this music comes from the drum parts. Like this double bass mixed into the slam riff right here. But a big part of it is also that super clean guitar sound. Again, you can hear everything that's going on inside the music. You can hear perfectly all of it's played, and that just makes it more heavy, intense, and unusual sounding. Coming up to another really cool rhythmic variation right here when the double bass speeds up. And again, it just seems really weird to me that these guys aren't part of the same conversation as stuff like Effigy of the Forgotten or Legion or Sinister when it comes to early examples of death metal just getting really fucking crazy. Like, just listen to these technical chugging riffs right here. Totally on par with stuff that Suffocation was doing around the same time. But another really cool thing about this being very early brutal death metal is it maintains a lot of old school death metal feeling to it. In fact, quite a bit of this album sounds very akin to a very sped up and brutal death metalified version of old school Death or fellow Dutchman Pestilence. Check out that lead guitar melody on top. Sounds like some spiritual healing Chuck Schuldiner shit.
Good band, actually.
And yet all this old school sounding material manages to coexist with that stop-start grooving brutality of newer brutal death metal. Wait, what?
お前はもう死んでいる。何?
Okay, right here, this is probably the craziest drumming on the album. Listen to this fucking cymbal work. Fucking bonkers, hitting all kinds of chinas, thrashing everything around. Got this brutal fucking breakdown riff under it. Polluted Inheritance's first album, Ecocide. Fucking nuts, especially for 1992. And even nowadays, incredibly impressive stuff. Their later material gets even weirder.
Pretty unusual ass, like the big ass cigar. So
it still maintains that percussive brutal death metal feel, of course, but with that more expanded guitar sound and an even more clinical tone, it almost sounds like Mental Vortex era Coroner if they decided to go Suffocation style. Drumming gets even more nuts. Some might say a little too nuts. Take it easy there, Buddy Rich. But they also still know when to rein it back in and go a little bit more old school death metal with things. Like this build up and introduction of groove variation sequence right here. Classic fucking death metal, but still off kilter enough to be recognizable as Polluted Inheritance. As each time the riff repeats, it introduces some weird new rhythmic thing going on. Like something gets slightly modified, subtly changing the course of the music with each new repetition of the riff, before all of that complexity and weird almost jazziness finally explodes outward as we hit the solo section. And let me tell you something about those solos. They're just as weird and almost jazz fusion-y as the rest of the music. Particularly on this, their second album, Betrayed, the lead guitar goes absolutely nuts, keeping up with that truly impressive drumming. Polluted Inheritance is, if you ask me, mandatory death metal. It's a damn shame people don't talk about this band more. It's a damn shame that more new bands don't take influence from them, because they are sick, and their shit is actually easily available nowadays since it was all reissued by Vic Records. Desecration as well is usually available on the cheap, particularly on Discogs. As far as rotting goes,
Come back when you're a little, richer.
that stuff's still crazy expensive to own in a physical format. Seems to be the case for a lot of the old United Guttural Records bands, unfortunately. But all three of these bands are definitely worth your time if you want to take a little trip around the world and see what brutal death metal has to offer in terms of variation. Definitely not always the one-note genre it's made out to be. Hopefully I managed to convince you of that assertion over the course of this episode, but even if I didn't, thanks for listening or watching or whatever you did, and I hope to see you again next time. Bye-bye.
Toast to the CEO of YouTube. Thank you for providing this website.